Sure.
So, a very good evening to one and all. It's a great honor and pleasure for Indian Students Congress, ISC, and for me as the chairman of Indian Student Congress to welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor to Aula of the University of Göttingen. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor. Ultimately, a long wait of 1 year, 6 months, and 9 days has come to an end. Dr. Tharoor is here with us in Göttingen. Above all, it has been a wonderful journey that became fruitful today. An organization for Indian students and academicians to use their expertise, knowledge, and ideas for the betterment of our homeland. We have spent a wonderful time here, away from our home and nation, for education, career. Now, this is our time to give back to our nation. So this led us to think about an organization to use our expertise back in India. I remember the day when I sent my first email to Dr. Sam Pitroda with my ideas and motivation. Within a couple of hours, I received a reply saying, "Please call me later to discuss this." I was astonished that a person who was an advisor to Rajiv Gandhi and Dr. Manmohan Singh has asked me to call him back to discuss my ideas. So from there, he gave me this opportunity, and now the Indian Student Congress has formed. And today, we are looking forward to get new ideas from Dr. Tharoor to further strengthen ISC. Indian Student Congress is an organization for Indian students and academicians living abroad and willing to give back to our society. Being an ISC fellow, you will be able to meet and share your ideas and thoughts with leaders and policymakers. ISC will provide you a platform to sharpen your organizational skills. ISC's experts network will help you to share your expertise with fellow Indians. As you know, the NRIs play a crucial role in the economy of India, so as the foreign remittance, but we can do a lot more. To start with, we are planning a few collaborations with India. Dr. Tharoor will have a hand-holding discussion with the Faculty of Organic Agriculture Sciences, University of Kassel, for a research collaboration with Kerala Agriculture University. Also, the Managing Director of Sonda Global Infratech Group, an Indo-German group involved in environmental projects, particularly in waste management and circular economy, is here to meet Dr. Tharoor. The company is creating sustainable infrastructure for environmental sector, and ISC is more than happy to facilitate the discussion. Edge Varsity, an EdTech platform focused on skill development in engineering, diploma, and technical education arena. A company fills the gap between industry needs, expectations, and the present education system. Company shareholder and managing director is here with us, and we are looking forward to have a fruitful discussion with Edge Varsity. We have also made initial discussions with Youth Conservation Action Network, UCAN, an organization in Chennai which spreads environmental education among school children. ISC is planning to collaborate with UCAN and spread awareness about nature and its conservation among children through collaborative projects. I'm glad that Dr. Shashi Tharoor has accepted our invitation to deliver the inaugural lecture. Shashi Tharoor, Member of Parliament from Thiruvananthapuram and Chairman of Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. He has also served the nation as a Minister of State for Human Resources and External Affairs. During his career in United Nations, he rose to the rank of Under Secretary General and finished second in 2006 selection for UN Secretary General. In the final round, Dr. Tharoor received one veto from United Nations. And later, the US Ambassador John Bolton revealed his instructions from Condoleezza Rice. We do not want a strong Secretary General. Dr. Tharoor is a well-renowned author. He has written 18 best-selling works of fiction and non-fiction and hundreds of columns and articles in New York Times, the Washington Post, Times, and many more. He is the recipient of numerous awards. To be cited, the Commander of the Order of Charles III by the King of Spain, Global Leader of Tomorrow by the World Economic Forum Switzerland, Zakir Hussain Memorial Pride of India Award, and PETA's Person of the Year Award, and many more. I welcome Dr. Tharoor to the City of Science. Now, I would like to welcome Mr. Himanshu Vyas, Secretary, All India Congress Committee, Mr. Parmod Kumar, President, Indian Overseas Congress, Germany, Mr. Santhan Walia, Vice President, Indian Overseas Congress, Germany, Mr. Netra Bandhari, Director, India Office, Göttingen International, Dr. Bernd Hornberg, Envoy of Dean of Faculty of Organic Agriculture Sciences, University of Kassel. Welcome. Before inviting Dr. Tharoor to the lecture, I would like to thank my team for being supportive and motivated to make this day happen. So you all should clap for them. So now I welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor to deliver his inaugural lecture. Welcome, Dr. Tharoor.
Thank you, Rahul. And what a splendid setting this remarkable aula is. And it's so nice to see you all here and to realize that an event of the Indian Students' Congress can attract and assemble such an impressive crowd here in Göttingen. My first visit, and I hope it won't be the last. Very, very pleased to see you all. This is, of course, for me, an initiative that is close to my heart because I spent more of my life as an NRI than as a resident Indian myself. As you've already been told about my nearly 3 decades with the United Nations, but in fact I was actually born in London and left at the age of 2.5 to come to India, grew up in India till the age of 19, and then went out again to graduate school in the US. And then from the age of 19 till I returned for good to India at the age of almost 53, I had lived abroad. So if you think about it, I still haven't managed to live half my life in India because I came back to India, entered politics. I've had a very interesting career, but at the same time, the majority of my life experience is as an NRI. And so being asked by Rahul and the Indian Students' Congress to talk to you about the role of NRIs in nation building is to me a particularly relevant topic close to my heart because throughout the time that I was abroad, India and the emotions that the very idea of India conjures remained very close to my heart, shaping my convictions, my outlook towards the world, and indeed the better part of my writings. Most of my books, in one way or the other, relate to issues about India that matter to me. And as I used to remark soon after an interview I gave after the publication of my first novel, I once perhaps rashly said, India matters to me and I would like to matter to India. And now, years later, I have a chance to actually put my own feet and my own life and my own energies and enthusiasm towards making myself matter to India, and that's what I've been doing in the course of these rather tumultuous 10.5 years that have been in our public life in politics. But I see the same sort of sentiment is very much there amongst most of our vibrant NRI communities around the world, because the fondness and passion for all things Indian has always been, I think, an integral part that animates the communities of Indians living abroad. We've not even talked about NRI, this title that everyone assumes everyone knows. I see a few non-Indians here. India invented this official term for its citizen expatriates. NRI stands for non-resident Indians. In a book I wrote 22 years ago, India from Midnight to the Millennium, I suggested only half jokingly that the real question is whether NRI should stand for not really Indian, or never relinquished India, because in many ways there was a bit of both in most Indians. In fact, in many ways I would say that many of these Indians had ceased to be fully Indian because of their long residence in foreign countries, but they had never relinquished that sense of loyalty, affection, allegiance to India that made them also people who had never relinquished India. And given the remarkable achievements of our expatriates and the extraordinary impact they've had in our adopted communities around the world, I changed my mind after some years and said, no, actually they belong to a different expansion of the term NRI. They are the national reserve of India. And that applies, I would say, to all of you here. Indeed, one of the reasons why NRIs matter so much is the long and illustrious history of NRIs in our country. Let us not forget that our most famous NRI, perhaps the most famous expatriate to make a return trip to the country, was our father of the nation, Mahatma Gandhi, who alighted from his ship from South Africa in the port of Bombay, as it still was called, on the 9th of January 1915, and went on to unite an entire country in the sole quest for liberty, equality, and freedom from colonial rule. Now, as former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh put it in one of his memorable addresses, our NRIs have always been united by an idea of Indianness. This Indianness embodies the diversity and pluralism of both our country and our diaspora. And in turn, the global Indian community reflects this idea of Indianness, this very ethos of India. Our heritage is a diverse and democratic country, open to the contention of ideas and interests within it, unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world, wedded to the pluralism that is our greatest strength in a democracy, and determined to liberate and fulfill the creative energies of our people. If you were to look back at the formation of the NRI communities, there have probably been in the 19th and 20th centuries 4 major waves of emigration. The first wave actually is before 19th. It preceded the era of imperialism and colonial rule. It comprised of an assorted collection of travelers, teachers, traders, who, despite the social norms and conditioning of their day, bravely left India and ventured out to forge their own destiny in the outside world. The second involved the forced migration of Indian labor as indentured servants of the British Raj, because when the British were forced by public opinion to abolish slavery, they replaced it with indenture instead, and indentured labor worked in slave-like conditions, I'm sorry to say, in many of the colonies of the British Raj. They forcefully were displaced from our land, from our country, and transplanted in colonies like as far afield as Fiji towards the east, and Guyana or Trinidad on the west, and of course South Africa, Mauritius, and so on in between. And they were also transplanted into the theaters of war in the First and Second World War, as well as the plantations of the world, the rubber plantations of Malaysia, the tea plantations of Sri Lanka, and so on. The British are very good at moving people around for their interests and benefit. And third, though painful it is to remember, was the tragic displacement of millions of people, an estimated 13 million people who lost their homes in the horrors of partition and whose wounds have not totally recovered. Some of them fled to our country, some went to other countries. One of Singapore's most brilliant diplomats was the son of a partition refugee from Sindh. And there are people in many other countries who also left because of partition. And then finally, perhaps the most recent vintage of people like you, that is the fourth wave of migration, contemporary phenomenon of skilled Indians seeking new educational opportunities and professional challenges in our globalized world. So I would probably divide this fourth wave further into 2 distinct categories. Sort of the A category is all of you, highly educated Indians. You go abroad to study and then you stay on to do further work and perhaps acquire new professions, new citizenships, new identities, and then more modestly qualified professionally, so less professionally qualified, but often harder working migrants, from taxi drivers to shop assistants, who generally see their migration as temporary, who are driven by economic necessity. Their families often leave their families behind and go, and who remit a large share of their earnings and their income to India. Very often a much larger share than the higher earning professionals do, because higher earning professionals start their families in the West, and they're not there to support their families in India, whereas a lot of the blue collar workers do. And that's why remittances, which were briefly mentioned by Rahul, are actually overwhelmingly provided by blue collar workers to their own families. And we can come back to that later. But anyway, both sets of these fourth wave immigrants remain closely connected to the motherland in ways in which the earlier waves could not be. If you had gone off to Fiji or Guyana or Suriname in the 1850s or 60s, how do you stay in touch with your village? You were probably illiterate. There was no worthwhile postal system. Obviously, no other means of communication, no jet planes, no letters, no phone calls, nothing. And you lost touch. You knew you were Indian. You brought with you some memories of some customs, some religious rituals, perhaps some specific holidays your family celebrated. But beyond that, you were cut off from the sources of your identity. Whereas that's 150 years ago, 200 years ago. Today, all of you can be in touch with India at the press of the click of a mouse, at the dial of a phone, and thanks to VoIP, it doesn't even cost. When I went abroad to the US as a student, it was $12 a minute to make a 3-minute phone call to my parents. Sort of meant I had to starve for a week. Whereas all of you can call for free on a wide array of internet applications. So you're in a different league today. Now, all of you are also more successful than the earlier lot. And so India inevitably tends to regard you as a source of pride, support, and investment. Not only do we see our NRIs as net contributors to our economy and society, but also as positive reinforcements of India's image abroad. The recent American survey, for example, that found that Indian American households' median annual income was not just the highest of any ethnic group in America, it was nearly $12,000 higher than the next highest, which is Japanese American households. So Indian Americans are that much more affluent and successful than Japanese Americans. And it was about $20,000 higher than the US national average. So white Americans are systematically less affluent than Indian Americans. It's quite an astonishing figure. This was greeted with much fanfare in India, of course, as was the statistic that Indian Americans have the highest level of education also among any ethnic group in America. Because a lot of Indians go there to study, acquire lots of degrees, stay on, etc. Now, you may think that success is only at the elite end of the scale, but it's not true. The story that I often like to tell, so you may have already seen me telling it on YouTube, is about Britain, where Indian restaurants, or curry houses as the Brits call them, have become so popular, proliferated to such a degree, that these Indian curry houses employ more people in England than the iron and steel shipbuilding and coal mining industries put together. So the empire can strike back. Now, the presence of successful and influential Indians in so many countries is obviously a direct source of support for India. For our country receives billions of dollars in remittances, and there are several other economic benefits and investments that collectively drive a large part of our growth as a nation. As of 2018, India was the largest receiver of remittances globally from our diaspora. We got about $80 billion in remittances last year. And China, which used to be number one till quite recently, came a distant second at only 67 billion. So Indians are not only sending money back home, but collectively remittances account for roughly 2.5% to 3% of our total GDP. And often these contributions are pivotal to the success of the recipients in India. Today, as India's economy continues to grow, a number of NRIs are returning to India and starting entrepreneurial ventures. This phenomenon, which even has a label now, it's called returnee entrepreneurship. There are prominent Indian startups. A couple of names that I've come across are Sundaram Medicals, Mitra Biotech, which were actually founded by NRI returnees. They had built their careers abroad, decided to come back to India, started these companies, and they've become very successful Indian startups. NRIs remain a key source of investment in the country. They come in on a more regular basis than foreign direct investment, inevitably, because Indians feel they have a stake in India. NRIs invest in a number of avenues, ranging from the usual fixed deposits in banks. I think you're all too young here to remember the days when the government was going through a foreign exchange crisis and offered a better rate of interest for Indians putting money in hard currency in Indian banks. And many of us took great advantage of that back in the 70s and 80s. But of course, equities, mutual funds, real estate, all this have come to life. And the UAE is obviously in many ways a star performer. Over 20% of all NRI investments in India come from Indians in the UAE. May help, of course, that in the UAE they don't give citizenship to foreigners. So the Indians are never allowed to feel they could make a new identity for themselves in the UAE, unlike in America or even Germany, where you can acquire the citizenship and the identity of this country. In the UAE, you can't, so they keep their loyalty all the more entrenched when it comes to the homeland. Second is the US, though, and third is Saudi Arabia. There's a report from 2017 by the outfit called Square Yards, which estimated that NRI investments in real estate alone would touch $1.5 billion in just the top 8 cities of the country, and that's about 20% of the total market. So the top 8 cities of our country account for a real estate market of $60 billion. $11.5 billion of that is NRI investment. So NRIs are driving real estate in India as well. However, NRI's support for our society is not just limited to remittances and family and friends, or even investments in the Indian economy. There are other kinds of support that NRIs have given in helping build the Indian nation. I just remember what happened exactly a year ago, and many of you have probably read that we are again experiencing severe rains and resultant flooding in many parts of India, and once again in the state of Kerala, which was the biggest sufferer last year. When last year, in August 2018, when Kerala went through these extreme floods, unprecedented in the modern history of the state, and this year's floods were not even remotely as bad as that. To give you one example, last year we lost 480 lives. This year we lost only 105. So, you can see that there was a difference in the intensity of the suffering. But last time, millions of people were displaced, had to be accommodated in hundreds of relief camps. First, many had to be found. Many were marooned on rooftops and so on. Then the relief camps had to be set up across the length and breadth of the state. Billions of dollars of damage was wrought on the state's already stressed infrastructure. But as the floods ravaged the state, NRIs from across India, but particularly, of course, NRIs from Kerala, all around the world responded spectacularly and generously to the relief and coordination efforts needed in our hour of need. Not only did many of you contribute significantly to the Prime Minister's and the Chief Minister's disaster relief funds, you also went above and beyond by complementing official rescue and relief efforts via social media. Keralite software engineers, along with volunteers from across the state, that is NRI Kerala software engineers with volunteers from across the state, assisted operations by mapping inundated areas, even setting up an international website, keralarescue.in, to help coordinate efforts, getting the Navy connected. I'm told that when the CMDRF, the Chief Minister's Disaster Relief Fund website crashed, given the unprecedented volume of donations and requests coming in, it was these NRI techies who came to the rescue to help improve the performance of the website. Even groups like the world-renowned Khalsa Aid International, I beg your pardon, although not directly connected to Kerala, where we have practically no Sikhs. They mobilized their resources, their volunteers, they held mass langars, which helped feed the victims of the flood. So there's an example of something where in a moment of crisis, NRIs contributed, helped save the nation. You have to save the nation before you can build it. There are other ideas. I was talking to young Rahul Raj, who invited me today, about the enormous potential for research collaborations between Indian expatriates attached to international institutions, top quality Western universities, and Indian universities which are not comparably well equipped. The one or two meetings that he mentioned that are going to be held after this talk are just examples of the kinds of things, but the sky is the limit. There's plenty of possibilities. And certainly, though I'm not in government but in the opposition, I think I have enough credibility in the government that I can make some of the introductions. So I'm very happy to listen to good ideas and pass them on. I do want to stress, of course, that beyond direct economic benefits, NRIs have also been an essential component of India's emergence as a global player in the international system. While I briefly mentioned the economic hardships and the economic benefits that India continues to derive from all of you going away and coming back, or continuing to bring to the country from outside, there is the intangible value of the soft power of India that our NRIs in many ways are the torchbearers of, a power that will reinforce our country's position as an influential 21st century figure in the global world order. Soft power, famously defined by my friend Joseph Nye at Harvard, is essentially the ability of a country to attract others because of its culture, its political values, its foreign policies, amongst others. And today, it's an essential component of every country's global image and foreign policy. And you folks are the embodiment in many ways of India's soft power. When you succeed, when you change the way people think about India. The time that I first went abroad as a teenager, the cliche about India was a land of poverty, people with begging bowls, fakirs lying on bed of nails, snake charmers at best. Today, the cliche about India is we're completely a land of computer geeks and software engineers. I remember meeting a rather anxiously perspiring European at Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam, who said to me, this is some years ago now, but it's a true story. He said, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop? You know, this was the immediate assumption that somebody in crisis would turn to an Indian. So, at the same time, look at America's image in the world. I mean, let's face it, Hollywood, MTV, McDonald's, Coke, Levi's did so much more for America's image as this extraordinarily attractive society, this progressive, liberal, capitalist bastion, than any of the multiple wars the US Army fought or any other government activity. The Bolshoi Ballet does more for Russia than marching into Ukraine. Right? So this is the way in which soft power really works. It emerges only partly because of governments, partly despite governments. So all of you are very much emblematic of India's soft power in the world. It's in this context that our massive diaspora, NRI population, have been pivotal to the growth and emergence of India in the global world. In order to have and utilize soft power, you have to be connected. Today, channels of communication, the internet, and the social media boom have all enabled Indians from within the country and around the world to stay connected. India has a thriving smartphone market with some of the lowest data charges in the world. There's constant connection, innovation, and creation of content from India that is shared across the world, and not just on the phones of NRIs. But I'm always amused sometimes when I get on WhatsApp or on email content created in India that has been forwarded to me by an NRI friend in America or somewhere else. That's globalization for you today, and it's also very striking the way in which the NRI community has been able to do that. Now, that's not the only way in which our culture has been spreading. Thanks to Bollywood, certain aspects of Indianness and Indian culture are being spread across the globe. This is not entirely new, but now it's become much more intense. Indian tourists going to places as far afield as Russia and Morocco will be surprised to find a local serenading them with a Bollywood ballad. And certainly in Russia, it's not uncommon for you to meet somebody who's a pretty old taxi driver who sees an Indian and says, "Avarahum," you know. So all of this is right there. And I remember my son, who was a Time magazine correspondent in Hong Kong for some years, traveled in mainland China with a Han Chinese friend. And obviously, the Han Chinese friend was given all the VIP treatment wherever she went, and he was ignored or treated with contempt until they got to Western China, to the Uyghur country, and Samarkand, Bukhara is further west, but in China you've got Xinjiang and the western part of Chinese Turkestan. And there, he says, they had no patience for the Han Chinese girl with him. It was they would greet him in the bazaars with cries of Shah Rukh Khan, you know. So that is still very much our image abroad. And it's not just Bollywood. The Bollywood has had a profound impact on many peoples, particularly Africans and Arabs. I can tell you stories from Senegal and Syria, but I won't waste your time this evening. The fact is that this is also true of our music, of our art, of our dance, our cuisine, and of course our yoga. I mean, every single German woman I meet seems to be practicing yoga. It's quite remarkable. But it's clearly part of India's cultural appeal around the world. And the presence of a robust and thriving NRI and diasporic population across the world has increased the awareness and emergence of India as a player in every respect of our international system, and that in turn is reinforced by all of you and will help India because of the goodwill it generates. Now, there's also ill will, and let's face it, when you're looking at good news, you also have to admit the bad news. There was a lot of negative coverage of India in European newspapers, rightly so, because of the horror stories being reported of attacks on women, for example. And many of us were shocked when we read a story about a woman professor in Germany who rescinded a PhD fellowship and scholarship to an Indian male student after reading these reports, saying, "I cannot have a student with me who comes from a culture that does not respect women." Now, somebody should have explained to the professor that, number one, the rates of assaults on women in India are only 1/5 the German rate. And second, that in India we actually worship the goddess in various forms far more than I think there are Germans who worship the goddess, who worship the Virgin Mary or any other female manifestation of the divine principle. But the fact is also true that cultural misunderstanding can reinforce negative stereotypes too. And it's partly, I think, upon you as Indians here to be able to set the record straight a little bit. There are things that go wrong. As a democracy, we talk about them, we expose them, we rightly beat our breasts about them, but it doesn't necessarily work to our favor when countries like countries in Europe report these negatives without the context or the frame of reference to understand them. But in today's increasingly globalized world, where there's so much of backlash against immigration, the India of diversity, of caste, religion, and language rallies around a democratic consensus, and acceptance is our great secret. That is, acceptance of difference. In the Western world, tolerance is the preferred expression. I think we need more than tolerance in a country like India, where the diversity is so rooted. We need to accept others, other ways of worship, other ways of being, other colors of skin, other ways of eating food, other ways of speaking languages, all of these as part of who we are. And that has been our greatest strength, and it's our failure to do that that in many ways could undermine our country. Our relationship with the global community has been symbiotic. So the strands of both sides of the relationship are equally important to create a resilient and a robust bond. In 2017, India held, under the Modi government, the first ever conference for PIO parliamentarians. PIOs are people of Indian origin. So PIO parliamentarians from across the world. And I'm pleased to say that the Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj invited me to deliver a keynote address to these PIO parliamentarians. And it was very impressive. We had people of Indian origin serving in parliaments in over 40 countries represented in this conference in Delhi. And there is, as you know, at least one from Germany as well who was there, as well as from other countries. It's great to have this common platform of our Indianness to further and reinforce our shared experiences and histories. Another platform which has gained even more popularity since 2003 is the Pravasi Bharatiya Divas, the annual gathering of expatriates, which seeks to engage and connect with the global Indian diaspora, showcase investment opportunities in India, and so on. To my knowledge, no other country has quite anything like it, this annual jamboree of the diaspora conducted with great fanfare by the government. But we need to do more than just host events to empower and enable our NRIs. I think we need to offer more rights and privileges and opportunities. As somebody who was an NRI, I fought for the rights of NRIs as a delegate to the Pravasi Bharatiya Divasas. I know of the difficulties and challenges in feeling connected to this country, to our country, that some feel when they live abroad for many years at a stretch. For one thing, NRIs are citizens of India who happen to live abroad. And I know they're also foreign citizens. They qualify as PIOs in our distinction. A PIO is a person of Indian origin with another passport. An NRI is an Indian with an Indian passport living abroad. But in fact, most people, when they say NRI, mean both kinds of people. But the fact is that if you're still an Indian passport holder, why don't you have the right to vote in India? Why shouldn't you have the rights of Indian citizens living in India? So I introduced a private member's bill that would permit this more easily. And I also introduced a private member's bill that would permit dual citizenship, which some other countries do permit, the US, the UK, Ireland, Israel, Pakistan. They all permit dual citizenship, but India does not. And my argument, of course, is that while some conservative and so-called patriotic Indians look down upon those who forsake their Indian passports because they have jobs or lives abroad, I've always maintained that taking a foreign passport for economic compulsions or even for merely travel convenience does not make our brothers and sisters any less Indian. I think there are many who are Indian in their heart and give up their passports with great reluctance because they have no choice under Indian law when they have to become foreigners. But if they could keep both, they would be proud to be Indian as well as American or German or whatever else the possibilities would be. I think it's also important that the vote be provided, as I mentioned. NRI voting is a controversial issue in India. The only law so far that's been passed is one that gives them a chance to come back and vote during the elections. But how many people are going to come all the way to India from wherever they are to cast one vote? Most will not. But most democracies allow voting in the National Embassy, where you have the right to go and cast a ballot. Or today, with electronic means of voting possible, why not create a system in which our NRIs could vote with a secure, encrypted way from their computers at home? So all of these things, I think, need to be explored further, and I've tried as chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee to also discuss that. And I do believe that ultimately all of you should have a voice in these matters. Whether you stay abroad or whether you go back after the end of your studies, these are things you could do. There's some interesting people who have it both ways, and you could be in that category one day. There is people who build a career in the outside world and then seize an opportunity to go back. It's striking, for example, how many Western companies are sending Indians as their head of those companies in India, of their Indian operation. These are Indians who obviously had migrated some years ago to the countries where these companies are, but they've come back. And one of the things that's often amused me is seeing ambassadors and high commissioners of foreign countries of Indian origin. Right now, the Australian High Commissioner in India is a good Punjabi Sikh lady born and brought up in Malaysia called Harinder Sidhu. Her predecessor was Peter Varghese, born and brought up in Kerala. Not quite her predecessor, there was another one in between, but there you are, they've done it twice. All of these things suggest to me that you can have interesting forms of return. The High Commissioner of Canada, who's just said his farewell, sadly, so I'll miss him, is Nadir Patel from Gujarat. who is representing Canada in India. And all of this suggests that in many ways, that interest, that involvement, that caring, that concern, that connection is not only not absent amongst the individuals, but is valued by their new countries as an asset to them as well as to us. That's the best outcome, a win-win situation for both us and the new countries of the NRIs. Thank you for listening to me. I really wanted to have an interactive session and answer your questions or your comments, whatever's on your mind. So I'm going to try and stop there. Thanks for everything that all of you are doing to stay interested in and involved in India. And thank you for listening to me. Jai Hind.
So thank you very much, Dr. Tharoor. So the session is open for questions. So someone got a question?
Yep. Anyone on anything? It doesn't have to be only on NRIs. You can talk about Indian politics or whatever you want to talk about.
Swarnim, there is a lady.
Hello. Thank you. Hi. Thank you for that very
You can
inspiring
stand up,
talk.
please. The camera is there, so.
All right. I think my question is something that you touched upon only briefly. So with regard to the politics, right? The fact that we can't vote is a huge disadvantage to people who stay abroad. But apart from that, as NRIs, I think the fact that we're away from the country provides a sort of an insulated environment where we can kind of stay blind to things that are happening in the country. So would you have, and I've been thinking about this, would you have more concrete ways in which Indians living abroad can participate, can have more involvement in the politics, in political matters of the country, especially in times like now?
Well, there are 2 or 3 obvious ways that people are already doing. One is definitely by participating in the national discourse, the national conversation on social media. In fact, some of the fiercest warriors of the BJP appear to be people who are comfortably living lives in foreign countries, but are passionately agitated about the rights of Hindus in India and so on and so forth. And I've always been curiously struck by the fact that when you go on their social media profile, they turn out to be parked somewhere in Europe or America or even the Middle East, where they thrive in an atmosphere of pluralism and diversity that they wish to deny to their own countrymen and women who happen not to follow their faith. But that also happens. So social media is one obvious way of staying involved. A second thing to do is to actually make it a point when you come back every year to take an active interest in political issues at home, attend meetings, participate in various bodies. The Indian Overseas Congress, which Himanshu Vyas is representing here, has chapters in every country, including in Germany, and often multiple chapters in different cities. I've just addressed a group of IOC members in Hamburg yesterday before coming here to Göttingen. When Rahul Gandhi was here, he addressed a rather large meeting in Berlin. So there's lots of opportunities where you can be involved while you're in this country, but also you can go back and through the Overseas Congress cells, make connections to people there. I've seen, for example, I happen to know the president of the Overseas Congress in New York, and during the recent Lok Sabha elections in Punjab and so on, he was very active there. He was campaigning, he was present. These things are entirely possible, and in fact, in Indian law, there is no bar on even a foreign citizen campaigning. There's only a bar on foreign citizens giving financial contributions. So you can actually come and support candidates without giving them money. A third thing that I've already mentioned in my speech is contributions and donations in times of need, flood relief, earthquake relief, all that sort of stuff. A fourth would be to try and support projects back home. There are various ways you can do this if you don't have the time or attention to be able to give to an individual project of your own devising. Support others. I know in the US, again, I give too many US examples because I lived there for a very long time, there's a group called Pratham, there's another group called Asha, both of which focus only on education in India. So they raise money in America, but they don't spend it in America, they spend it all in India in improving educational opportunities for underprivileged children, children going to government schools, that sort of thing. So there's a way in which you can directly support a good cause by giving money to a larger charity that will do the work that has a proven track record. But if you have the time and interest yourself, you could come back and start something yourself. I know NRIs have done everything from coming back and giving significant resources to their own childhood schools, to even starting their own institutions. One gentleman I met started a college in his village only for women, because he remembered his mother's struggles because she didn't have an education. So all of these things can be done, and really there are very few bars. I mean, the only thing that NRIs can't do really is vote or own agricultural land. Pretty much everything is open to you, and I would urge you all, as long as you care, please be involved. There are plenty more things you can do.
Yeah, here, please.
With history being distorted in so many ways nowadays by the leaders from the current government,
Yeah.
how is the Congress party, which you represent, planning to tackle this problem? And because it's imperative that you also present the alternate way of looking at our Indian history, which currently is being distorted to suit the current political taste.
Yeah,
And a lot of youth have been influenced, and what is your guys' plan on tackling
You know, it's a bit of a no-win situation, I have to tell you, because though I've been in the forefront of reacting with gusto to these attacks, and in fact, the Congress party has also often turned to me. I've done short videos on Nehru, on Rajiv Gandhi, and so on, in order to put something else out on YouTube that explains what historical reality actually was. And even in Parliament, I found myself, for example, giving them chapter and verse about what happened with Patel on Kashmir, rather than just blaming everything on Nehru. The fact is that it's a no-win situation for us, because number one, their relentless distortions of history inevitably put us on the defensive and in the explaining mode. And unfortunately, to most people, that doesn't actually look very good. Second, attacking us on history is a distraction from the failures of the present. This is a government that has been easily the worst economic managers of India, at least since 1990-91, when you had an equally disastrous but very short-lived government. There has never been a worse situation for the Indian economy than under Mr. Modi and his government. But no one talks about it, even though they're personally suffering and enduring it, because all the public discourse is about, you know, Hindu-Muslim issues, national security, terrorism, bombings, and history. So, on the one hand, I want to react because history is a subject I know and love and care and understand. On the other hand, I tell myself every time I'm wasting time replying to them on Patel and Nehru, they are destroying the future for the next generation. You know, should we not focus our fight on that? And this is a big challenge for the party. I personally believe that that the country is really in bad shape in all sorts of ways, economics obviously, but also in things of the moral character of the nation has been very deeply affected by this rampant bigotry being spread by those in power, people who really ought to know better. This kind of bigotry and sectarianism is in many ways foreign to the idea of India that came out of the freedom struggle. For me, when I speak of the idea of India, which is an expression of Rabindranath Tagore's, I'm always speaking of that key issue that divided our country back in 1947, because when the Indian freedom movement fought against the British, it didn't divide on ideological lines. It didn't divide between Marxists and capitalists or liberals and socialists. It divided on religious lines. One set of people said that religion should be the determinant of nationhood. And that was the idea of Pakistan. And they created a country for people of one religion. But the other set of people, Nehru, Mahatma Gandhi, Dr. Ambedkar, Maulana Azad, they said, no, our freedom struggle has been for people of every religion, every background, every language, every color. And our country must be for everyone equally. And they wrote a constitution which actually gave us the India that certainly I have grown up in and that most of you have seen from afar or near in the course of the last 70 years. Now that is such a fundamental, foundational idea of India that to betray it by reducing India into a sort of Hindu version of Pakistan is, to my mind, a complete betrayal of what the freedom struggle was all about. This would not be the country that Mahatma Gandhi fought to free. And that's why, for me, it's very important that we fight those battles also to preserve the India that our founding fathers bequeathed to us rather than let it be taken away by a bunch of very narrow-minded bigots.
Okay, so one question here.
So this is about a topic, something that you already mentioned. We as Indian experts feel very frustrated as well as helpless at times with the recent developments, and we wonder often what we can do to change the situation and the thought process of people who are the majority, who are thinking in lines which we cannot change. So your thoughts on that, please.
It's a tough one, you know. You can come and reinforce our hands, support politicians and institutions that speak up for tolerance, for good things, for the kinds of positive values that you believe in. And if you do ever come back, then come back and stay engaged and involved. Ultimately, you know, the famous observation that evil triumphs because of indifference, that for the vast majority of people, if they don't care enough to resist something, it will happen because those who passionately believe in the wrong thing have that strength of conviction to push it through, whether or not the others disagree, because the ones who disagree don't care enough. And that's, I mean, let's face it, Germany has had the experience of the 1930s, where so many members of the population, very proud culture, highly civilized, highly refined, allowed things to happen, not because they themselves would have ever done any harm to anybody, Jewish or otherwise, but because they didn't feel inclined to resist it when a handful of people led the country down that path. That could happen anyway. It could even happen, I fear, in 21st century India. Now, there are obvious, India of the 21st century is not Germany of the 1930s. We have a much more viable, functioning democracy. Germany had just been recovering from the destruction of the First World War. We have freedom of the press, social media, political parties, all of that. But certainly, the dangers are ever present. And if we're not conscious of them and we don't resist them, then of course anything could go wrong. And so it's extremely important that those of you who care about these things should reinforce the hands of those of us back in India who are fighting the good fight.
So I would like to close this open
No, let's see,
session.
lots more hands up here, it's okay. Let's go on for a few
But
minutes.
we have another 6 questions selected. So maybe I
Six
can open
selected
it.
questions.
I can open it once if we have time.
As you wish. All right. So,
Okay,
since that
so
lady standing up with the mic, let her finish and then
Okay,
we'll
yeah,
I have a mic.
take.
Thank you.
He's
Thank
got
you so
6
much.
selected questioners, so we have to give them a chance.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the questions as well, because I felt that your talk wasn't really political. Maybe it's difficult to be political all the time as a politician. So at this moment, I would like to ask, what do you think about the fact that a lot of dialogue amidst NRIs is quite right conservative in times of trouble that we face in India, especially even with the current Kashmir shutdown? We have a lot of dialogue that is being generated, which is quite anti-Islamist, which is garnering for a Hindu India. And it is great that NRIs are contributing to a great aspect of economy in India, but I think we have to be hypercritical about this conservative dialogue that is being formed. And what would you suggest? What is your take that to disseminate this as you mentioned, the idea of the original independent India, how do we do that actually? Because in many circles that I've come across here abroad, it's so easy to be some type of Indian which is so discriminatory, which is so casteist, sexist, racist, all these things. And it is a form of expression, freedom of expression even, but it doesn't take into account the fact that it has a very negative effect. It changes the momentum of things, even though you are an NRI. That said, the other comment that I would like to make is that I think it's very important to not sort of downplay the effects of assault, the effects of sexual violence that women face in India. And I think it's never an aspect of comparison. It's never good to compare it with another country. And this is a very, very major problem. Thank you so much.
Okay, on that point, I don't mean to minimize the thing at all. And in fact, I've been a strong advocate of various very practical measures to make it easier and safer for our women to walk in the streets and so on. And I was the first MP in Kerala to introduce a very simple idea of bringing my MP funds to have high intensity, high mass lights in various areas where women were walking alone and were in risk of assault and so on. So don't get me wrong. I was just saying that to deduce from one or two incidents in the newspapers that the culture doesn't respect women is a bit of a leap. But unfortunately, a highly qualified German professor leapt to that conclusion. We should be aware of the dangers of that. But anyway, coming back to your first point, which is the real one you wanted my comment on, I would agree with you totally, but at the same time, I would say that part of democracy now is allowing even those you disagree with to have their say, provided they don't shut you down in your right to resist it. So I am dismayed that things that would have been impolite in my childhood in India to even express behind closed doors in the privacy of your home are now being said openly from public stages and platforms as well as on social media. Really hateful, bigoted thoughts about communities, religious groups, and so on. Though I am dismayed that's happening, it is happening. It's too late now to shut the stable door. This is charging around there. We need to be able to react to it. I've never been in favor of suppressing opinions, because when you suppress something, it just thrives underground. Let it come out now. Let us know that there is this much of hatred and this much of bias and prejudice amongst our own people. We may as well discover it. But let's also fight them back and shame them. Secondly, however, what really bothers me is when there is a conflation of this particular point of view with quote-unquote nationalism, and that any opposition to that is immediately dubbed as anti-national. So when you have a kind of ruling party thinking that says the prime minister is the party is the government is the nation, therefore criticizing any of the first three is a criticism of the nation and is anti-national, then you essentially eliminate all possibility of reasonable discourse. Because, it's one thing for me to say, I respect your right to disagree with me, and here's why I disagree with you. It's quite another for me to say, but what you're saying is illegitimate. You are anti-national. I won't talk to you. Then there's no conversation possible anymore. And that's the danger that's coming out of many people in influential positions in this ruling establishment today. Okay, you've got your designated questions. Then we'll come back to the rest.
Manjusha Nadgowda from Berlin. Manjusha Nadgowda? Yeah, please come there.
From Berlin, hi.
Hi, I am a master's in water engineering student from
Wow.
Technical University of Berlin.
Right.
Actually, after the flow of these political questions, I have a political question in mind, but since I have sent the question, I
No,
have
it's
to
okay. You
stick to
can
it.
ask any question you like. No censure.
But you
We
will not get
are
an opportunity
Congress
for-
Democrats.
Yeah, probably next time when he opens the stage for other questions, I will ask those, but now I
I'm
will
willing
stick to this.
to stay as
So
long
what do
as
you
you want.
prefer, the political question or?
Whatever she wants.
So my question, I think it makes more sense for this topic, so I will ask the question that I sent. I study water engineering, and my vision is to go back to India
Great.
and improve the water situation in our country, because
Absolutely.
I have seen in Germany that there's a lot of privatization of the water sector, and there's enough people to take care of the water in this country. But in India, we know that water is basically monopolized by the government and the municipality, and there's not much privatization. So once students like me go back, we have to work with the governments and the municipalities, and we are going to face a lot of corruption and opposition in the flow of work. So what I expect to go back is growth for me as a person in my career, as well as some tangible improvements in the water situation in India. But we see the Ganga redevelopment project, there's a lot of money being pumped into these projects, but there's no real difference in the situation, ground situation. So what can we do? Like once we go back, what is the scope for us, and how do we face the challenges?
It is a tough one in the sense that there is a lot of very strong political resistance to privatizing water. Because the perception is that water is still a human right and not something that could be commoditized. So I don't think that's going to change very easily. But there is...
No, privatization of water, I mean like wastewater treatment and things.
So
like
individual companies are coming into specific aspects on a contract basis. So you can, for example, imagine a situation where the government has a project to, let's say, clean up a river, but it issues tenders for specific aspects, for setting up sewage disposal plants, for setting up effluent treatment plants, for setting up, I don't know, other kinds of water purification systems, and then private companies could bid for those tenders. That's entirely possible in the Indian system. So that's one way of being involved. The other is to come into the project design stage itself by joining the government, or at least by associating yourself as an expert or a consultant with such projects. I mean, it's been a national scandal that for so many years now, the Ganga rejuvenation project has been a complete bust.
Exactly.
I mean, billions of rupees have been poured into it, which have disappeared into the slush and the mud and the stench of the Ganga, which is now probably the dirtiest river on the planet.
Exactly.
I am told that some appallingly high percentage, over 40% of all of India's rivers, are classified as dead rivers. They are dead. There is no living organism in them anymore. That's entirely because of the terribly abusive way that people have been treating them. So I'm so glad you're studying this subject, because I think it's very deeply needed. But it'd be great if you could come back and do this, because India's moved past the stage where you could come as a German expert and advise on this, because no one will turn to you anymore. They want indigenous people and indigenous solutions. So come back and participate, but the need is enormous. You're so right.
Well, that is my ambition, but as we know, like, these sectors are controlled by the water mafia and the land mafia. So, you know, we don't want to go back and then get slaughtered by these people.
There's a very good very good book, I beg your pardon, called River of Life, River of Death by Victor Mallet, about the Ganga thing, which is worth reading because it actually shows you the kinds of things that went wrong and why, including, frankly, the corruption, jurisdictional issues, state government control versus municipal control, etc. But instructive for you to read. I would recommend it strongly. I released it in Delhi, so I have supported the author, but it's also a very good book, and it's very richly reported. He's a Financial Times journalist, so it's very, very well reported in detail. Have a look at it.
And sir, in technology mission during Rajiv Gandhi's time, there is a report on water.
Unfortunately, that's now more than 30 years old. Rajiv Gandhi, back in 1984, when he won the elections, one of his pledges was to rejuvenate the Ganga. That's the problem. So implementation is the problem. Yeah.
So Joshua Joy from Dresden. So please
hello.
directly to the question.
Yeah, just one question. I'm so happy that you came to Germany. And
Thank you.
And this is the first time I'm seeing an MP that too in Germany. And I'm from you are the MP of my birth city.
A little closer to your mouth.
You are the MP representing my birth city, Thiruvananthapuram. So
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
Okay, well, my question is a political one. I think you're aware, in 2026, there will be a delimitation of parliamentary seats. And when this happens, the states that have taken progressive measures against for population control will be penalized. And the states that have not taken anything, has done nothing, will be rewarded. And this has been followed even by the 15th Financial Convention when they look for the tax returns. Why don't we change this method? Why don't we penalize the states that have increased in population? Why don't we look rewarding states that are given back more revenues and give them more representation? So this way there'll be healthy competition between the states. But sadly, in 2026, we'll be underrepresented. So what is your opinion on this?
No, I've actually raised this issue. I was perhaps the first Indian public figure to send the warning bells on this, and I've written a couple of articles which I would urge you to Google. I think they're in the print.in, if I'm not mistaken. Just Google me on the subject. But very broadly speaking, when Indira Gandhi was Prime Minister way back in 1976, she took the unusual step of freezing parliamentary representation at the levels of the 1971 census, precisely because she didn't want the states that were making a serious effort to curb population by better development indices, human development, social development, and so on, to be penalized by losing representation in Parliament. That was a 25-year arrangement, which went on till 2001, at which point the government of Mr. Vajpayee unanimously renewed it without a serious debate in Parliament for another 25 years. The second 25 years expires in 2026. And since we now have a party in power that is a strong believer of Hindi, Hindutva, Hindustan, and since the states that have essentially curbed their population are overwhelmingly in the south of India, there is a real worry and anxiety in the south that the Modi government would not renew this arrangement. Now, one thing that's striking is that when the Finance Commission was appointed, for the first time, they were given instructions to take into account the 2011 census rather than the 71 census. So you already have a change, but the argument the government makes is entirely common sense. They're saying democracy and government benefits have to go to people, not to states. These states happen to have more people. Why they have more people is a different issue, but they have more people. Those people have rights. The government must cater to them. And even in terms of classic democratic theory, it's very difficult to argue with that. They're right. But the consequences for Indian unity have also got to be grappled with. Because if you create a situation in which the South is completely, in effect, disenfranchised, I think the last calculation I saw was that Kerala would go from 20 MPs to 14. But in the 2021 census, we're likely to lose population further in Kerala. So maybe even go below 14. There's a real concern that we're going to end up in a situation in which the emphasis on people will mean that the more developed, better educated, more socially progressive sections of India will have no political voice, whereas those who have essentially failed on all those indices will be the ones who dominate the politics of the country. If that happens and current trends continue, I really do fear for how many will react. I'm a strong and passionate advocate of Indian unity, and I think that we need statesmen and stateswomen who will have the vision and the foresight to put unity first, rather than their short-term political advantage in making certain decisions. But that's not guaranteed, and we'll have to see what comes up by 2026. Certainly, I intend to be a voice against this kind of disenfranchisement. Unless one overhauls the entire system and creates a different sort of electoral mechanism in India. For example, the American presidential system, where an electoral college gives every state the power to balance the other states. That kind of formula could work in India better than a pure parliamentary system where the sheer tyranny of numbers would drown out the South, the Northeast, and so on.
So, Musaini Al-Ahmad from Braunschweig.
My question is about education in India.
A little closer, please.
My question is about education in India.
About?
Vocational trainings.
Yes, absolutely.
So India lack an organized system of specialized trainings to promote certain jobs, certain professions, which are usually nowadays passed from one generation to another. So could these professions be incorporated into mainstream higher education? One, to strengthen the low strata of the society, and two, to destigmatize the...
What you're saying, my dear friend, is music to my ears, because this is exactly what I recommended when I was very briefly for a year and a half in the Ministry of Human Resource Development. Totally correct. In fact, the German apprenticeship system is a very good model to begin with, but it's deeply embedded in their culture and it's not in ours. We have a real problem in our country, because if you want to be a potter or a carpenter tomorrow, you better have a father or an uncle who's a potter or a carpenter, because nobody else will teach you. So what we wanted to do was to borrow from Germany and America the idea of the community college, which is that, first of all, we wanted to introduce vocational training in the higher secondary level. So from class 8 onwards, because class 8 you have a very high level of dropouts across India. I think our primary school enrollment is the highest in the world. About 105% of kids in the primary school age group are in primary school. By class 8, it becomes 58%. People drop out in large numbers. And many of these kids never get any other form of education or training afterwards. They are the kinds of fellows who end up as, helpers and mechanics in the buses and that sort of thing. Now, tea shops, that sort of thing. Now, these chaps, imagine if at the end of class 8 you're already exposed to certain kinds of trades in your schools. And if you show that you have no talent or interest for academic learning, but are good with your hands and you can do these other things, you can be streamed towards a diploma course. That's already the high school level. At the college level, the community college idea is very interesting. You have 2 years in a community college immediately after school rather than a university, because you don't get into university with the marks you've got. In those 2 years, if you were just goofing off in school and you actually have intellectual bent, but you now need to concentrate, if you show enough academic excellence, and after those 2 years you can be streamed back into a university. But if it turns out that you're really not academic material, but you've got some vocational talent, in those 2 years you can learn a trade, acquire a diploma or a certificate, showing you to be a qualified plumber, a qualified carpenter, a qualified mason, whatever it may be, and then we can unleash you onto the job market, but you'll actually be trained and employers will value that certificate. I'm really disappointed that after we lost office in 2014, the new government never took up this idea and never followed it through.
So we will go to the next person, Swayam Sahu. So we have to wind up in like 10 minutes, so please.
Sir, I'm Swayam. It's been a pleasure
So
being
many
a part
people
of your
waiting.
crowd.
Is there a time pressure at the other end also?
No, from yours.
No, that's okay. We can go on. We'll go on 5 or 10 minutes more. Go on.
Okay, sir, it's been a pleasure being a part of your crowd. My question is about education. We talked about brain drain that's happening from India to the US or India to the Germany because of better opportunities. But when we go to other countries, we have a limitation of how many people can generally go. But we do not have this limitation moving from one state to the other state in India, which causes a lot of job opportunities, let's say in Bangalore, for example, or New Delhi, and population transfer from this other states to these places. Then we have problems about traffic, groundwater shortage, and stuff like that. The other point that I want to make is we have problems.
But on the first one, the simple answer, we are one country. How can we now start saying that each state should have the right to restrict migration to that state?
Yeah.
By that logic, we will essentially become a collection of different countries. We will no longer be able to. In fact, right now in Kerala, because there's so little manual labor available, all these fellows have gone off to the Gulf. There's a large number of people from North India, Assam, Bengal, Orissa, UP, who are working in Kerala, even picking up Malayalam. Amazingly enough, the state first in the Kerala education system in Malayalam was a boy from UP called Muhammad Mohsin, who came first in the whole of state in Malayalam, a language that his family doesn't speak. He grew up in Kerala because his father had come over here and set up a tea shop or something. So this is India, this is the magic of India. Don't do anything to undermine it. I would welcome more internal migration. But get to your question, sorry, that was the first part of your thing.
So my question was to, my question is not just education, but quality education is what will facilitate rationality and critical thinking among Indians. And school teachers play a major role in this. And right now, the part of Indian teachers are not being given that much of importance. So my question is, could you give me your opinion about what should be the criteria of selection for Indian teachers and whether or not their salary should be increased so that it doesn't become a nobody's job?
Yeah, no, I mean, I've been again a very strong advocate, and all these questions seem to be feeding into my own biases and prejudices. I've been a very strong advocate of making teaching a more interesting and even more glamorous profession. We no longer, not no longer, we probably never did attract the best into academics. If you look at the top 10% of any graduating class, high school or college, and see how many of them actually went into full-time academics, you'll be shocked. Maybe 1% of that 10%. So it's really, really sad that people go into other professions if they do well in studies, but the people who are academically potentially the most able are the ones least likely to go into a full-time profession in teaching. Now, obviously, at university level, there's an exception there. You do get some very bright minds of academic bent, but I'm assuming you're asking about teaching at the school level, which is where the real challenge is. And a lot of the teachers are mediocre. Part of the problem is the profession has very little cachet in society, so sadly enough, we speak a lot about it. Mata, Pita, Guru, Devam and all that stuff. But the guru in the classroom is not given the kind of respect that should be done. And as you say, salaries are a very important part of it. Government school salaries are still supposed to be the best, and they're by no means very good by comparison with other sectors of society. And increasingly, you're finding the private sector stealing the best teachers anyway. So it's becoming a real problem. And I tried all sorts of stunts. For example, I managed to persuade a TV channel to host annual Teachers Awards and get some rich guy to sponsor some very generous awards, like ₹1,00,000 to the best teacher and so on. But it became very difficult and complicated to administer in such a large country. and nobody watched the TV show, so no one wanted to do it again a second time. Neither the sponsor came through, nor did the TV channel want to repeat it. But it's an issue. I would like to make teaching a more attractive profession, but at the moment, for example, we don't even do the basics right. We don't do enough refresher courses for teachers. So most teachers are teaching what they learned 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and they've not had any refresher courses to upgrade their skills and their contemporary knowledge. They haven't come up with any particular new research or whatever. The school levels, in any case, they rarely do. And at the university level, too, there's a certain sclerosis in the system. I'm open to good ideas, and I think, I was speaking to our education minister about the importance of a creative approach towards strengthening our teaching capacities, including perhaps giving beleaguered teachers more help through teaching assistants in all the classrooms. It's not like the Western world. In India, the average classroom is 45 kids. No teacher humanly can give equal attention to 45 children, see that they're understanding the issues, grade them comprehensively. It's not humanly possible. And therefore, if you're going to have such large classrooms because your population is so large, you need to put at least one assistant per class to assist the teacher. These are things you can do to make the profession more better equipped to cope with its challenges. But give us our other ideas. I think many of us are open to these things, and I'll certainly be happy to be an advocate. Education and foreign policy have been my two big issues anyway in my years in politics. Happy to take that forward.
But Dr. Tharoor, when it comes to the primary education, don't you think we should more focus on an education based on morality? Because I have seen LKG students' book, so a one woman is interpreted as fair, beautiful because her skin is fair, and another one is having a dark skin and it is ugly. So,
well, those are very silly biases and prejudices. You're right, that kind of thing exists, but that shouldn't happen. I mean, there should really be a check on these things. I've also, in my time, we introduced a values education kit in all the central schools, where every child from class 6 onwards is taught ethics and values as part of school curriculum and not just something that you expect the parents to impart at home. There's no question that school can be an extremely valuable place for teaching values, because most children spend more time in the classroom with their friends and with their teachers than they do with their parents at home. So yeah, I think there's a lot more that can be done. Part of the challenge is our system where school education is a state subject. And though the central government has the right to have central schools, those are only scratching the surface in terms of numbers. So the real emphasis is at the state level and varies very much from state to state.
So Dipankar Dubey from Hanover.
Good evening, sir. I'm Dipankar, a student of Electro and Information Technology from University of Hanover.
Sorry, what technology was that?
The literal translation, I guess, would be Electrical and Information Technology.
Okay, right. Impressive.
So, my question is, how could we move to a more developed, propaganda-free and fair India when opportunities and reservation are still given based on caste and religion and not based on economic adversity and capability, which is causing its misuse by the so-called oppressed of the upper strata of our society? And how can a country like India truly develop when its own foundation is still based on discrimination, regardless positive or negative?
Yeah, this is a battle that in many ways has been lost before it's been fought, in the sense that I think we started off with absolutely the right intentions in the Constitution by introducing the world's oldest, farthest and farthest reaching and most significant affirmative action program, which reserved places for the Dalits, the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, to undo 3,000 years of discrimination in Indian society. And unlike other affirmative action programs in the Western world, these are programs that guaranteed outcomes and not just opportunities. So in America, for example, affirmative action merely means you can try and you'll be considered with sympathy. Whereas in India, affirmative action means that X number of positions in government, in colleges, in universities, in teaching positions, even in parliament, are reserved only for people like you. So, for example, if I had wanted to contest from my parents' ancestral villages in Kerala, I could not have, because that constituency is reserved for scheduled caste candidates. Now, that's the system we have, and I think in many ways it's admirable, because It's a society coming to terms with the fact that for 3,000 years we have, let's put it very bluntly, we have really mistreated an entire section of our society on the basis of birth alone. And as a society, as a civilization, we owe them more than an apology, we owe them a reparation, and that's what this is all about. Then matters got further complicated with the 89 Mandal report and the OBC reservations, because now it means that it's already up to 50% of everything that's now reserved. And there, the frustrations of many from other communities have been spilling over. Now, I have to say that in some ways, there is no effective answer to this. Part of the problem is that, I don't know how much, you're an electrical engineer, you probably know that in many Western railway systems and subway systems, there is a thing called the third rail that runs between the two rails of the railway track. And if you touch the third rail, you're instantly electrocuted. So reservations are the third rail of Indian politics. If any Indian politician tries to touch it, he will be fried within a second. And that's why it is always consensual, always extended without a debate. And to speak against reservations for either sets of people would be seen as completely sacrilege, and you would essentially not be in a position to how can I put it bluntly, you would not be in a position to actually survive politically if you did so. So the result is we are stuck with that, and what remains is the rest. Now, at the moment, this is still manageable because in the same period of time, the last 25, 30 years, the governmental space has been shrinking. The government is less and less the only or the principal employer in the country. And more other sectors of society are booming and thriving, and opportunities for people in places where there are no reservations have continued to grow, whereas actually opportunities in government and in government positions, public sector corporations are shrinking. Now, with the present government heavily committed to privatization, that's going to become even more the trend. So I would say that those of you who are upset about this may have to recognize that in government there will be very severe limitations on your opportunities, and that you may as well learn to live with it. But conversely, there are many more areas in which opportunities will exist in the non-governmental sector in which you can make a major difference in our country too. I think this debate had more salience in a time in which the government was the principal employer, was the most desirable employer, and had a monopoly of most of the meaningful possibilities in our society. That's simply no longer the case.
So, Devashish Singh, Genova, please be first.
Hi.
Hi.
So
Genova, you've come from Italy?
Sorry?
Italy?
Yeah.
Oh, wow, okay.
I plan to be in the neighbor, so I thought I would come and say hi.
Hi.
Since you spoke about the growth of globalization and connectivity in India, I would like to frame my question in that context. So, as an opposition leader, what strategies can you think of, like effective strategies to combat the systematic brainwashing of masses that is going on in India by the abuse of technology, to spread hatred, intolerance, lies, misinformation, and to convert people into ideologues of nationalism, nationalism of a wrong kind, not a right kind. So what?
As you can imagine, I agree completely with you and share your concern. But having said that, there is no easy solution. There's one good short-term solution, one good long-term one. The good short-term solution is to counteract bad information with good information, is to reply, to put out as much that washes the brain the other side and not just their side, to have corrective information going around. And the second longer-term solution is improve our education system so that our youngsters come out with a brain that has been sufficiently understanding of context to be able to gauge some of the far-out claims. But I can assure you the challenge is great. When your Prime Minister says that Lord Ganesha's head on a human body is proof of existence of plastic surgery, you have to despair, because common sense will tell an average person, not even a very educated person, that the smallest imaginable elephant head cannot be grafted on the largest imaginable human neck. And therefore, how on earth could this have been done? It was merely meant to be a symbolic, metaphorical image. But by making such a claim, the Prime Minister himself actually discredits the actual truth, which is that India did invent plastic surgery, that the world's oldest plastic surgery operation was a rhinoplasty conducted 2,000 years ago by Shushruta, for which the actual surgical procedure and the instruments have been found by archaeologists. So we actually have a proud record in surgery in India. But you make these ridiculous claims and you completely discredit the truth. The same with these absurd ideas that we had jet engines and Pushpak Viman in the Ramayana and so. I mean, this conflation of myth and rationality, this complete indifference to logical fact, science, numbers, all of this is unfortunately part of the mythologizing and the self-aggrandizement of those who have come to power today. It's a far cry from the scientific temper that Nehru wanted to instill in India. And so we are facing a real challenge of how do we manage to drive out this kind of bad information with good information. We need more of us to do it. I think one of the great things in social media in India today, the existence of fact-checking sites like Alt News. They don't hesitate to debunk claims on the liberal side of the fence also. They're not purely a liberal agenda, but they have been able to take apart claim after claim with detail. They have a full dedicated team of researchers doing nothing but busting these myths. The problem is how many people read the truth and how many are still passing around the lies. That is a real challenge. The only solution has got to be you create a better education system in the long term that will produce people with the discernment, the judgment, the basic context to be able to understand, as you and I can, what is junk and what is credible.
When I was around very small, then I realized that I was born in a Hindu family. So my mother said, okay, don't worry, there are 33 crores of god and goddesses and one Muhammad and one Christ will, it's all okay. Just respect and stuff. In that kind of a country, when I left 15 years back, and when I look back now as a journalist, I am totally shocked because of this, truly simplifying patriotism with nationalism, with all this, whatever we talked about today. And then a totally undemocratic move by the government regarding Kashmir. So, because I have to ask you this, in this point, what is the impact in your mind will this kind of Kashmir issue will have on India, on the people of India, the youth of India, and also people like us who's living abroad?
Ooh, that's a lot of people to impact. Look, on India, I think it's had a very alarming and worrying effect because it has really been a betrayal of the spirit of our democracy. The government did what it did, and I think all of you know enough, so I won't go into the details. In any case, if you really want to know my full views on the subject, please Google me on YouTube. My speech in Parliament on the Kashmir issue is only about 15 minutes, and it's got my detailed critique. Plus, I've written about it in various websites. But the point I'm trying to make right now is that it's done violence to the spirit of our democracy. The Supreme Court may yet find that it did not violate the letter of the law. We'll find out there's a case in the court. But it definitely violated the spirit. You don't change the constitutional status of a state when its own legislative assembly is suspended, its leaders are all locked up, telephone lines are cut, internet is down, you have a curfew and a clampdown, and then you say that the consent of the governor is equivalent to the consent of the state, and consultation with the parliament in Delhi, where the BJP has a majority, is equivalent to consultation with the state assembly. It's not, and it's obvious that this was an act that really is deeply worrying for Indian democracy, both because it was a wrong thing in itself, and also because if they can do it to Kashmir today, they can do it to some other state tomorrow. So it's a very, very serious issue for us. What is the impact on youth? In the short term, it's been very much one of more unbridled national pride and chauvinism. The government has whipped up the sentiment, muscle flexing. I would say that probably objectively, as a critic of the move, I'm probably one of 10%. 90% of the country is probably supporting the government on this, including many in my own party, to their eternal discredit, because obviously they have abandoned the principles that brought them to this point. Having said that, when you ask about the impact abroad, things can get a little more complicated, because the problem is that the opposition to this abroad has come only from Pakistan and China, which are both countries whose record on Kashmir is worse than ours. I mean, Pakistan has already done every single one of the demographic, administrative, and political sins it's now attacking India for in the part of Kashmir it occupies. 97% of POK now is not Kashmiri, it's Punjabi. And so to criticize India for doing something which could lead to demographic change in Kashmir is much worse than the pot calling the kettle black. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, on the one hand, they recognize Kashmir as a disputed territory. On the other hand, they've actually allowed Pakistan to give them large parcels of land in Kashmir. And they've, of course, conquered a certain bit of Aksai Chin by their own force of arms in '62. So neither country has any legitimate claim to making self-righteous noises about Kashmir. And therefore, even as an opposition member, my inclination is to obviously rally behind the flag and rally behind my country when it's unfairly attacked by two of the worst offenders on the subject of Kashmir. So that's on the international side. And finally, when it comes to the impact on NRIs and so on, I think you have to fight your own battles. If you agree that something wrong was done, I don't see any shame in saying so. In fact, maybe you should communicate to more and more of the Indian authorities when they come here that your own credibility as a democracy has been undermined, and that the soft power of India, which they're so proud of, has been undermined by the kind of negatives we're seeing in the media in the Western world about what happened there.
So the last question, Connor.
Hi, Sanjay from Göttingen. It's just a very absurd question. What will be your take?
Sorry, a little closer because I'm not.
What will be your take if I claim it's just an idea that the very idea of India independence, which we celebrated just a few days back, was an absurd historical blunder by Congress?
The idea of Indian independence?
India is, as I said, it's an absurd question, because every day I hear that there are so many historical blunders has been committed by Congress, right? If someone comes to it, what will be your take?
Well, would you have preferred dependence and colonialism and the foreigner ruling you?
I'm not, it's an indirect question. What will be your take? Nowadays I hear so much, so many claims, absurd claims in India. It's all a matter of perception.
Oh, no, we are so much better off, despite everything that I've been criticizing. We're so much better off in 70 years of freedom than we were under colonial rule. I mean, colonialism stripped our country of its resources, its wealth. It was like leeches sucking our blood dry for 200 years. And you want to maintain that? No. I mean, for me, the question is not even worth asking seriously. I misunderstood me. Well, we'll have to then rise up and turf them out of the next election. That's what democracy allows.